Good morning and welcome to the Intellectual Property Breakfast Club for September 2010. My name is Drew Clark. I'm chairman and publisher of broadbandbreakfast.com, and we're really excited to start the new year off with this great group of people and a wonderful topic and even set of topics. Just a word about Broadband Breakfast for those of you who don't know us. We're a news and events company. We focus on the National Broadband Plan, broadband stimulus, and intellectual property. We have monthly breakfast events such as this one, the Intellectual Property Breakfast Club. And then on the third Tuesday of each month, next Tuesday, we host the Broadband Breakfast Club, and we have a very exciting discussion next week on Title I, Title II, how should broadband be classified? So encourage all of you to register to attend that event. I also want to encourage you to fill out the form on your seat for this session. It will help us to know the things you're interested in. We've been doing the Broadband Breakfast Club for 3 years now, and so we have gotten to know the broadband community well, and we're getting to know you as the intellectual property community here in Washington, and hope that you will give us your advice and feedback on these events. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our sponsors, National Cable and Telecommunications Association and Public Knowledge. We thank them for their support and ask you to join me in expressing our appreciation. We have a great group today to talk about the Obama administration's intellectual property czar and will she crush internet piracy. We also want to talk quite broadly about the issues of intellectual property in the Obama administration. There have been many topics, and part of this series, of course, is to engage a broad group of stakeholders from the technology community, from the intellectual property, content owning community, the telecommunications community. All of these groups have a stake in the intellectual property world, the broadband world, and how the issues get discussed and resolved. So I'd like to introduce the panel here. My left, your right, we have Stephen Mitchell. And Steve is the vice president, I guess I'll call you Stephen to avoid confusion with our other panel member by the same name. Stephen's at the Entertainment Software Association. You can read his full biography on the table. But he has distinguished a background at the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection and also the Senior Counsel of Computer Crime and Internet Property and Intellectual Property Section of the Justice Department, CSIPs for short, which is obviously well known in this community. And will have a lot to say on issues of internet piracy and the administration's approach to it. Next is Gigi Sohn. Gigi is the president, co-founder, and animating spirit of Public Knowledge. Known her for years. She's a great friend and support, and I really appreciate her being willing to join in this discussion today. Now, I'll say a word about Gigi's schedule in just a moment, but we really appreciate her being here for this discussion to kick this series off. Then to your right is Casey Ray Hunter. Casey's the communications director and policy strategist at the Future of Music Coalition. Future of Music Coalition's a very vibrant group, always have great conferences, and we'll hear some interesting perspectives about the musician community and their take on intellectual property, at least the Future of Music's view of their take on IP issues. And then finally we have Steve Tepp. Steve's the Senior Director of Internet Counterfeiting and Piracy for the Global Intellectual Property Center of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And Steve has been a great sounding board on topics pertaining to this series. We did a kind of a trial version, May, June, and July, and now we're happy to launch this series for the whole year. Steve knows so much, but he can't say as much as he knows. He worked at the U.S. Copyright Office and was quite involved in the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, but he is recused from speaking about that. So we'll talk about other things besides that, or at least when we talk about that, he won't be able to say anything. But it'll still be a fair fight because Gigi Sohn has to leave at 9:30. So we hope that we'll have a lively discussion about many topics here today. Let me actually start our discussion off by raising the Obama administration's intellectual property plan. I printed it out last night, plus several of the comments about it, 63-page report. And here it is on paper. This was released in June of this year. And Steve and I were talking before the start about how when it was unveiled, there were 6 cabinet members in the presence of Victoria Espinel, the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator. So it's been greeted with some interest and attention, but at the same time, the report didn't get the popular press going as much as the National Broadband Plan, which is another national report which we've been covering and following and doing breakfasts on. So I'd like to ask our panel, what has been the impact of this report that the administration issued in June? Is it a good thing that it hasn't been as high profile as the National Broadband Plan? Steve?
Well, I don't know that it hasn't been as high profile. I think it's been a different kind of report. The National Broadband Plan is exceptional. Most agency reports don't get rolled out with a $100 million budget to go pay for broadband throughout the country. That said, the fact that this report, the IP strategy, was issued not only with half the cabinet, but the Vice President of the United States as well, and was followed immediately by hearings in the Senate the next day and about a month later in the House, tell you that this is not your ordinary sleepy government report that goes and collects dust on a bunch of shelves around town. I think this report is setting the agenda and setting the tone for intellectual property policy discussions and coordination discussions here in Washington and throughout the country. And I think it's raising awareness for some of the pressing current needs in intellectual property enforcement, and it's clearly had an effect on the policymakers both in the agencies and on Capitol Hill, so I think it's great.
How has it clearly had an effect? What's the concrete result of this so far on the agency heads?
Well, I mean, it's only been, what, almost three months since it came out, so, you know, and one of those months was August when nothing happens here in Washington, but the fact is that the hearings on the Hill demonstrated very sincere and extensive interest in a number of the items that were raised by the report. I know the USTR is working on its mandate to expand the notorious markets section of the Special 301 report to reach rogue websites, sort of the worst of the worst on the internet, sites engaged almost exclusively or exclusively in online counterfeiting or copyright piracy. So sometimes the wheels turn a little slowly here. 3 months seems like it's not quick, but in reality, I think we're going to see in the coming months a great deal of activity that can trace its origins back to this report.
Gigi.
So let me give a different narrative. I don't disagree with a lot of what Steve said, but first of all, I think one of the reasons that this report hasn't gotten the same amount of press is that it's a moderate report and very well balanced. I mean, the broadband plan, whether you agree with the pronouncements or not, there were a lot of very, very bold recommendations in there. And this does not have bold recommendations. It has actually reasonable, balanced recommendations, focusing really on IP enforcement as opposed to changing the entire lot of IP law. So that's number one. Number two is the big kicker of this report hasn't quite happened yet, all right? The report, the recommendation in the report that gave me the most pause was a recommendation of a 120-day period for the IP enforcement coordinator to make legislative recommendations. And those recommendations, I think, I know they're being formulated. I actually got an email from Victoria this morning, and they're thinking about things. I think that's where you're going to get more bang for your buck as far as possible controversy or discussion, because that's where the real, when the IP enforcement coordinator is going to start to tell Congress what it needs, that's where I think you're going to see more discussion, more controversy. And look, I have one more point. Unlike the National Broadband Plan, where there's pretty much universal support for universal access to high-speed broadband. I mean, there are very few people or companies that disagree with that goal. There's definitely disagreement, not only among stakeholders, but even within the Obama administration about how strong IP enforcement should be. One of the premises of this panel was that the Obama administration appointed the first IP czar. No. Congress told the Obama administration to appoint the first IP czar. And that's a really important distinction. I think there are definitely warring factions, depending on where you are in the Obama administration, some who'd like to go whole hog and adopt every single thing that Steve's members want. And then there are others who are more sympathetic to organizations like mine who say, hey, let's go slow. Let's talk about balance. And let's talk about really enforcing the laws on the books as opposed to developing new laws that would change copyright law.
Okay, appreciate the correction, Gigi. That's right, that it was Congress's mandate, and Congress, of course, drives the laws of intellectual property. What are you expecting to come down the pike next month? What are some of those things in the 120-day window that you're hearing about that might upset some of the stakeholders that you're most familiar with?
Well, I mean, Steve put his finger right on it. At least in the Senate, I don't know so much in the House, right now, the Judiciary Committee, they're working on legislation that would try to get at websites whose entire purpose is to infringe and sell, fool people into buying first-run movies. I'm not unsympathetic with an attempt to, it really depends on how it's crafted. But if it's crafted in an overreaching or too broad manner, or puts too much responsibility on ISPs and credit card companies to stop infringement, there's going to be problems. Also defining what is a pirate website, what is an infringing website. That's the key question. So we've seen outlines of the legislation, but it never has that definition. So that definition is going to tell you whether you're really going to get at the bad guys or whether you're going to start to suck in Google and eBay and others who you don't want to suck in. I think that's certainly going to be one of the recommendations. But as usual, the devil's in the details. One other point on that, people may have seen a couple months ago, the Customs Service went after a bunch of these so-called pirate websites and basically, took down the websites, basically took away their domain names. And the question that I keep coming, and nobody raised a row about it. We all said, yay, great, wonderful, for the most part. There were some due process issues. But for the most part, I think there was very little hue and cry. So the question is raised, if you can do that already, if the government already has the power, what do you need the legislation for? So I think that's going to be the hottest topic, in my opinion.
Steve, the Entertainment Software Association put forth some thoughts, as I think all of your organizations did in this proceeding leading up to the report, and you flagged the need for greater enforcement of technological protection measures, the locks, the digital locks, if you will, that exist and are, of course, given force by the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. But what's your concern about TPM's, technological protection measures, and how they can be circumvented?
Well, if I can draw back to the discussion that's
Go ahead.
thus far with this. I was quite pleased to see in the strategy that the IPEX office put out the approach that was taken there. I think the recommendations there were right-sized, and they focused on the statutory mission of the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator, which is to coordinate and make more effective agency efforts. And so when I personally think that the judgment that went into right-sizing the recommendations in that strategy are also going to be reflected in this legislative review that's currently ongoing. And I'd like to just say, I think we may be overblowing what comes of that process in the same way that the recommendations in the strategy were bite-sized, agency by agency, geared toward allowing those agencies to do their own discrete jobs more effectively. I think at the end of the day, that's what we're going to see out of the legislative recommendations process too. And the fact that the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator has initiated this legislative review process is not extraordinary at all. This is the kind of thing that any newly formed commission, board, coordinator would do in the natural course of his or her responsibilities and in trying to discover the legal landscape in their subject matter area. So if folks are waiting for the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator to bring tablets down from the mountain that contain new ideas about how intellectual property needs to be enforced in this country, I think they could be disappointed. What we're going to see are the results of these interagency reviews being submitted to the interagency process. We might not even see the raw data. We might not see what the Department of Justice views as gaps in its own enforcement authority, or what Customs views as gaps in its own enforcement authority. All of this will be submitted to the interagency process, and Victoria and her office will look these over, and they will be folded into other White House legislative priorities. And so I'm very optimistic that the same sort of good judgment that went into the recommendations of the strategy itself will continue in any legislative recommendations that result as well.
I do want you to get TPRMs,
Sure.
TPMs, but before, let me just come back to the comparison with the broadband plan for a moment, okay? So the broadband plan was also mandated by Congress in its passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. FCC needed to come out with a report in 12 months or 13 months, as it turned out. But they didn't need to make it the big thing that they did, right? I mean, you referred to no one's going to come down with something new and innovative from the mountaintop about intellectual property. But then I would ask, well, why not? Why is there not the same need in the intellectual property realm as we have in the broadband realm?
Well, the first thing you have to realize, and I would underscore what everyone else has already said, that the key word in IPEC is coordination, or coordinator. With intellectual property and copyright in general, we're pretty familiar with the fact that a lot of consumers have suddenly been interacting with copyright in a way that's just unprecedented. Well, you can say the same thing for federal agencies and governmental regulatory bodies. The purpose of IPEC in its creation was to get that field to understand many of the issues that were now interlinked. So where there's contention around IPEC, I don't think it's there. What we might be looking at a little bit further on down the road, which would kind of intersect more with broadband plans in general, is the idea that you could compel ISPs or network providers to be proactive. And you see this word proactive not just in IPEC reports, but in other provisional recommendations made by government bodies that ISPs need to become more proactive. Now, when and where that happens and how that's described and executed is, if you're looking for the real contentious battle, that's where it's going to be.
On broadbandbreakfast.com, we're publishing news about intellectual property issues, the news of Mary Beth Peters' retirement yesterday. There's also a story that the band manager of U2 wrote in British version of GQ, in which he's basically saying exactly what you mentioned, Casey, that ISPs need to be kind of pushed into a more proactive role vis-a-vis infringement. I'm wondering if any of our panelists have any thoughts on this proposal, where it's coming from, and what its chances of getting linked up with the IPEC agenda are.
If I could just add one thing about that. I mean, to us, Future Music Coalition, one of the things that we recognize is that creators and musicians and even rights holders aren't a monolithic group. So you're going to have a range of opinions here on any of these issues. One thing that's interesting is how it plays out at the agency level and at the regulatory level. That depends on agency expertise, agency culture, and comprehension of the issues. So if you're telling the FCC, for example, to be copyright cop, that might not be the place. And I think that, you know, Gigi could certainly speak about that more. So it really depends on where and how you develop a process to either through technological remedies or legal remedies to have that make sense and not be overbroad. Because again, for us, we're more concerned about, or as concerned about, folks having access to the marketplace as we are protecting their intellectual property. Both things are very important because one's your bread and butter, and the other is how you actually exploit your intellectual property in a free market. So it's really going to depend on how this stuff gets worked out in either statute or in rulemaking at the agencies. And right now we don't know because we haven't seen anything more than just a set of, we would like this to look like this if we began to coordinate.
Gigi.
So to me, the question is this something that the ISPs and the content holders work out themselves, or is this something that government mandates? And I actually think the question of whether government mandates increased liability or increased duties for ISPs has already been answered in the negative. And the reports, you know, talks a little about encouraging agreements, but there's no mention of statutory mandates. And if anybody wants to have that fight, it will be World War III. You know, you asked a question, is the DMCA going to be reopened? I have some ideas why it should be reopened. They have to do with providing fair use protections for circumventing technological protection measures. But if the discussion is going to be along the lines of, you know, should we weaken the safe harbors for ISPs or for websites, it's going to be World War III. And frankly, I don't think anybody wants to get involved in that discussion.
Do ISPs want their safe harbors weakened?
I'm sure, I'm not an ISP, but I'm sure they don't. I do work with them in a copyright coalition that I run, and no, they do not want their safe harbors weakened. I mean, that of course is the pickle for them, right? Because I'm sorry I have to hearken to the issue from next week, but this really is an open internet issue, right? If ISPs are made to, either by law, by agreement, filter your every bit to see if it is infringing, and that's impossible to tell unless you have a judge in that filter, whether something is a fair use or not, that has implications for an open and free internet.
It also costs money.
It also is very expensive, right. If this was such a damn great idea, I think that the content providers would have paid for it already. So a lot of this is about cost shifting.
Absolutely. Steve, have you had a chance to develop any thoughts? What is the chamber kind of process like with regard to this particular question of ISPs and taking a more active role in filtering for copyright infringement?
Well, I'm not going to focus on filtering because I don't think there's a lot of talk about that in terms of mandatory filtering. Certainly, filtering has been the subject of voluntary agreements, and that's been a very productive tool. No one's talking about mandatory filtering. No one's talking about weakening safe harbors. These are straw men. Let's put something on the table that's realistic. You know, internet companies are members of the chamber too, so we're very sensitive to all those concerns. And the great challenge of the internet age in terms of intellectual property is how do we craft rules that hold the bad guys accountable for doing bad things, but don't unintentionally sweep into their ambit legitimate activities of legitimate companies. And in my experience, internet companies are perfectly willing to cooperate in the fight against online piracy and online counterfeiting within certain limitations, and I think they're reasonable ones. They don't want to be the ones, from what I hear with my conversations with them, to have to decide what's counterfeit, what's infringing. But if they get an order from a court, for example, they're willing to take action to deal with that. I think that's a reasonable position. I think that's a position we can work with to help address what is an incredible problem here. And you know, we're talking about the ways to resolve the problem without having really described the problem yet. And maybe we've taken that for granted and We all recognize that online IP infringement is a huge problem. And if that's the case, then we've made some progress, because I fear that there are still some who either deny the scope of that problem or deny the harm that it creates. But let me take just a moment to remind folks of what the problem is here and what is the basis for this policy discussion. Reports have shown that 18 million Americans are employed by IP-intensive industries, that U.S. intellectual property is worth between $5 and $5.5 trillion, that IP-intensive industries account for about 60% of U.S. exports. So this is huge to our economy. And the administration, the president himself has said he wants to greatly expand exports. IP is a huge part of our exports, and protecting IP is going to be a huge part of increasing our exports and bringing our economy back to life. The harm from internet piracy and counterfeiting, $58 billion to the U.S. economy alone annually. Global losses from internet piracy are in the range of $250 billion. These are critical losses in the most cutting-edge areas of our economy and the global economy. And so I think it does call for a lot of attention. I think the report is doing a great job at bringing attention to that. I'm very happy to hear that Gigi agrees with us that it's a balanced report. And I think the administration, notwithstanding a few sort of mid-level bureaucrats who have their own agendas, when you look at what the leaders of this administration have said about intellectual property, it's uniformly that it's critical to our economy. Secretary Locke from the Commerce Department, Ambassador Kirk at USTR have said that over and over, Vice President Biden, and even the president himself. And it's not the normal thing to hear a president talk about intellectual property, but President Obama said, we're going to aggressively protect our intellectual property. Our single greatest asset is the innovation and the ingenuity and creativity of the American people. It is essential to our prosperity, and it will only become more so in this century. If that's what the president says, I don't think there's any debate about where the administration stands.
What's the debate here?
Well, I mean, the debate is words are very nice, and I can talk about the millions of jobs and the billions of dollars that are put into the economy by the fair use industries, okay? Matt Shears's group, CCIA, did a study showing, how many jobs are gained for companies working for ISPs and search engines and so on and so forth. We can match you number for number. I can debate you as to whether your numbers about how much is lost, are real or not. It's not important. The question is not whether intellectual property is important. We know it's important. It's important to the economy. The question is, what do you do to enforce intellectual property laws? And if what you want to do is kick people off their internet service after 3 allegations of copyright infringement, that's not cool. All right? You're seeing more and more countries around the world saying that access to the broadband internet is a human right. I'm waiting for the US to say that. So if that is indeed true, if that is the gateway to jobs, education, creativity, innovation, do we really want to start kicking people off the network based on 3 allegations by a copyright holder that somebody has downloaded songs or downloaded movies?
Let me just try to get at what the issue. You cited a number of statistics, Steve. Are those from the global, from the Chamber of Commerce, or from the report? They're from the IP report.
They're from neither. They're from various different sources.
Okay.
From the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, from different economist studies, Stephen Sywick, Shapiro and Hassett, NDP Consulting.
Okay, and so
And I
guess
think it's
the
notable
point
that
is
Espinel didn't rely on those numbers.
Gigi is making the point that other industries rely on other facets of copyright, fair use, transport. Is this important? I mean, what's the import of the numbers here? There's a problem, right? That's what you're saying, Steve. And how is the chamber wanting the IP enforcement coordinator to approach this because of those numbers? What should the U.S. be doing differently because of those substantial numbers you cited?
I think the point is, whenever you're having a policy debate or discussion, you need to start out with what is the issue, how important is it, and what's the problem? And when you define those things, then you can start to decide what's an appropriate scope of a response. The statistics that I've cited indicate very clearly that intellectual property is a huge part of the US economy, and that online theft of intellectual property is a huge problem and a huge hindrance to the growth of the US economy. This is about jobs in an economy that desperately needs jobs. It's also, as we all know, particularly in the counterfeiting sector, about health and safety. There are documented cases of infants dying in China from malnutrition because their parents were buying counterfeit baby formula with little or no nutritional value, and they were feeding their kids what they thought was a perfectly good formula, and these poor infants starved to death. And this is among the most horrendous stuff you can think of. The US military has to worry about counterfeit parts getting into its supply chain so that Black Hawk helicopters don't fall out of the sky over Helmut Province because some counterfeit microchip or ball bearing or what have you was accidentally found its way into the supply chain for the US military.
Let's get some other voices in here. Stephen and Casey, and I want to invite you all to think of your questions, and we'll get to you in just a moment.
I'd like to draw back for a moment to the question of online piracy and what should be done about it. And I would encourage us, again, to reflect back on the IPEX report as a point of departure. The coordinator's office, I think, recognized the key here is in encouraging cooperative efforts within the business community, encouraging a number of interested stakeholders, including content owners, ISPs, ad brokers, payment processors, to work collaboratively to address online infringement. Now, the environment for addressing online infringement in a hosted context, when the infringing material is hosted by the ISP, has very much been facilitated by the safe harbors that are created within the DMCA, and it has created a very, very useful and effective cooperative environment. I would suggest that if that same level of cooperation were able to be brought to the problem of infringing transient content, we probably wouldn't even be having this discussion. The cooperation would be occurring behind the scenes, and really the only people who would be feeling the effects of it are those who are infringing.
Casey.
You know, here's some, since I'm such a sunshiny person, I wanted to take us away from the baby formula thing, because that just, my heart dropped. And I also wanted to throw out some numbers. Independent creators in the United States on the music side are responsible for 30% of the music that's released in this country, and I think it's around 80% globally. So again, I want to stress the importance of balance in any remedy, because honestly, for us, the happy, magical double rainbows place is a legitimate digital music marketplace, okay? And that marketplace will compensate the creators, but it'll also give those creators and rights holders and entrepreneurs and innovators access to the means of transmission and the means of production, so on and so forth. So when we're talking about the DMCA and whether the safe harbors are appropriate, or whether 3 strikes is appropriate, or even whether a new type of DRM is appropriate, or filtering or watermarking is appropriate, we have to maintain that sense of balance, that a great deal of the productivity that we're seeing online is happening from people who are able to innovate on those platforms without any undue restrictions. So within that great complex, sort of ball of wax, we have a very equally compelling, in my opinion, and probably in the opinion of a lot of the people that I think I'm speaking for today, we have an equally compelling reason to want to keep those lanes open for that type of innovation and that type of market-driven phenomenon.
All right, let's go ahead and open up for your questions here. Just raise your hand, and the microphone will travel to you here. So.
Thanks, Steve Warren, Steve Warren with Metricos. At the risk of sounding like a C-SPAN call, I have a comment and a question. Cool thing about the internet is that it lets you do fact checking in real time. With respect to the quantification of the problem of counterfeit, I think most of intellectual property issues, I think most of us are familiar with the GAO report that came out a while ago, which said most experts observe that it's difficult, if not impossible, to quantify the economy-wide impact of piracy and counterfeiting. And the GAO has looked at all of the reports that you've been citing and essentially said they're all questionable. There's no data that anybody agrees on this valid. With respect to the comment that, gee, nobody's talking about filtering, Jacqueline McCulloch noted that Kerry Sherman was complaining that YouTube could, quote, stop filtering tomorrow and have no liability. Nobody's talking about filtering? Of course we're talking about filtering. So those are the comments. Here's the question. It's been noted by many people that what enabled the internet to have the explosive growth that it's had over the past couple of decades is the fact that ISPs were not required to proactively monitor what was going on, to proactively filter. So the question is, if we want to change that, do you feel, A, that's a wrong observation? No, we would have had all of the explosive growth of the internet if we had been requiring ISPs to be proactive. Or has that time now been in the past? That was good then, but now we can start doing things differently. Or is there some other phenomenon involved that if we now required ISPs to be proactive, that we wouldn't lose the benefits that we've had of the internet over the past couple of decades?
And let me supplement this by asking, are there good examples that everyone can agree to of ISP copyright holder cooperation?
Well, I mean, we've come out in support of the sending of warning notices, and which there was quite a bit of data put on the record with the IPEC by the ISPs showing that the recidivist rate of people that received those notices that said, we know you're doing something illegal, stop it, was like under 10%. It was a tiny amount. So if people think that somebody is watching them and knows that they're doing something wrong, they will stop that behavior. You know, another question you asked was, will the IPZR stamp out piracy? All right. Piracy's been with us since long before the internet was a gleam in anybody's eye. The U.S. was one of the first pirate nations, okay? We stole everybody's intellectual property in the 19th century. The question is not whether it can be stamped out, is whether it can be, you know, controlled to levels that are acceptable. Okay, I think a 10% recidivist rate for sending warning notices, which, you know, there's no filtering involved, there's no blocking of content involved, that's pretty darn good. I don't know why that isn't good enough.
The gentleman mentioned, you know, YouTube and YouTube filtering, and I think it's important to make the distinction between, you know, an ISP and an edge service or content server filtering. And I think that what you might see there is, you know, technology improving, getting cheaper to implement, and actually solving some of the problems without having to get at the, you know, the pipe level. And it would be interesting to see what greater cooperation looked like between rights holders and the services that are you know, maybe could, and even if they have safe harbor, could go the extra mile and actually start looking at what's on their network. And on the other hand, you have to have the rights holders understanding that they need to get their house in order a little bit in how they actually meta tag their files. I mean, we've been dealing with stuff like that on the compensation side forever. I mean, it's hard to pay somebody when you don't know who to pay. Well, it's hard to filter something if you don't know what it is. And I think slowly but surely the technology and that type of cooperation will increase to the level where perhaps we can avoid the sort of nuclear option, which is installing detectors at the, you know, network level or the pipes.
Could I just add that the YouTube model for sort of edge filtering works really well. People don't know what it is. Basically, is content holders upload the content they want protected to a reference library, and if something on YouTube matches it, YouTube gives the content holder the option to either take it down, leave it up, or monetize it. And I believe in the vast majority, I don't know the numbers, but I think the overwhelming majority of cases, the content holder, the copyright holder chooses to monetize it. That is, put up ads. next to it. So that kind of model really works for the edge. But the network, as Casey said, he's absolutely right, is completely different.
They also get market intelligence. I just wanted to throw this in there. Like the motion picture industry is a little bit more advanced than the music industry is here, but they can tell you if a teenager in Poughkeepsie is really into this one scene in this comic book movie, if they watermark it properly. So there's market research, demographic research, and that type of intelligence that they can gather in addition to you know, cold hard cash.
Steve.
You know, it's a little disheartening to continue to have the debate about whether IP infringement is a problem and questioning statistics. Yeah, of course, when you're trying to prove what would have been without IP piracy, that's hard to do because you're trying to demonstrate something that's hypothetical. How would the world have been if? So yeah, there's some difficulty in doing that, but smart people have done hard work and I think come up with responsible and reasonable numbers on that, and I've mentioned them some of those this morning. The fact that the anti-IP authors of that GAO report questioned it, you know, okay, there are some who continue to deny that IP piracy is a big problem or that it has significant effects to our economy. I mean, that same report said IP piracy isn't a problem because, hey, it creates jobs in the pirate industry. I mean, I don't think that's a responsible answer to the issue. You know, in terms of filtering, I think what YouTube is doing is great. That's the sort of cooperative efforts that we do need, and I wish that there were more folks who are willing to step up and do that sort of thing. We also have to realize, and the notice and takedown system is a great system, and it's worked very effectively. And the 10% recidivist number is one I'm not familiar with, but that's encouraging as well. We also have to realize that there are elements out there beyond the sort of good faith consumer who may not know what they're doing is wrong or may not realize it or may not even think about it. There are hardcore commercial pirates out there. Some in the US, many outside the US. These folks are in existence, in operation, to benefit from other people's intellectual property, selling counterfeit products, infringing copyright. They don't care about health and safety. They don't care about US jobs. They're not going to care about a notice from a US ISP or a right holder. They're not going to hear for 1 second a call for any sort of cooperative approach like voluntary filtering. These are the sort of folks that we need legal remedies against.
Stephen, just quickly, what's your take on what your members are doing in this area?
We are making good and effective use of notice and takedown for hosted content. We continue to send notices regarding transient content in the US and get some good responses. We think that an awful lot can come, you know, I think it's unfortunate that a policy discussion quickly jumps to mandatory this and mandatory that, when I personally think that an enormous amount of benefit can be achieved with better compliance in the rules frameworks that already exist, by subscribers abiding by their terms of service, by ISPs enforcing their terms of service to a greater degree against violators, and taking the steps necessary to prevent bandwidth abuse on their systems. We are quick to consider mandatory this and mandatory that in the introduction of new rules when we're not really using the rules and the frameworks that already exist to their greatest effect.
Okay, we got another question over here. And please identify yourself.
Tom Sidner, Progress and Freedom Foundation. Just a quick comment on that GAO report. I did a paper on it called Punked, just to point out how utterly idiotic it truly was. I invite anybody who thinks that they should take that report seriously to read my paper. It is simply ridiculous. Gigi, question for you. I'm glad you're in favor of notice forwarding, so am I. I think that's an excellent first step towards remediating online infringement, but I think public knowledge bears a special burden in this particular matter, because remember, what we have discovered in the 5 years since Grokster is there are an awful lot of people out there on the internet who intend to induce mass copyright piracy, and they intend to get away with that by shifting most of the risks to consumers. And in the Grokster case, Public Knowledge defended those entities to the death, even arguing that they should not be liable even if they intended to induce consumers to infringe copyrights. So the real question one of the questions we're facing now is, okay, we had some bad people who made a really big mess that they can't clean up. How do we want copyright holders to fix that? What do we want to do to remediate that situation? And I wonder, is there anything else other than notice forwarding or lawsuits like Tenenbaum or Thomas Rassat that Public Knowledge is in favor of?
So we lost the Grokster case. We live with it. We deal with it. 9-0. We lost, so get over it. We're actually working with the Senate to try to craft something narrow on the online infringement bill. If it can be crafted narrowly, we'll be likely to support it, or maybe more likely not to oppose it. So, you know, that's one step that we're taking. We'll have to see what the other recommendations of the IPEC are. I have to say that I agree with my colleague to the right, is that a lot of the problem is enforcing the laws that are already on the books. I don't see any, I mean, I've got a whole prescription. I'm more than happy to tell you about Public Knowledge's Copyright Reform Act. And,
Tell us about it, Gigi.
well, we have basically 5 prescriptions, actually 6 prescriptions for bringing more balance to copyright law. I can tick through them, or you can just go on our website. I think it's copyrightreformact.org.
Which one has the greatest chance of getting part of a copyright package if that were to come forward next year?
Well, I hope Orphan works. I mean, that to me is a no-brainer. And we, you know, that was actually something when Tom was on the Hill we worked with him on. And that is, you know, trying to ensure that if a person want to use a copyrighted work, there's a good faith search to find the owner, cannot find the owner, that they are able to still use that work without the threat of huge statutory damages. It's a no-brainer, okay? We got so close. We got a bill in the Senate in 2008. And I remember campaigning for Obama and begging Howard Berman on the phone to put the Senate bill, hotline it in the House, and he would not do it. And he would not do it because the MPAA didn't want it to happen, for reasons I can't imagine, because they don't have orphans, and they probably do use orphans. I don't know why they did it. I don't know if it was out of spite or what have you, but it's a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you want people to be able to use these works, most of whom the copyright holders are either dead with no heirs, defunct company, and if the copyright holder does come to the fore and say, you used my work, they get compensated. It's a beautiful thing. So orphan works, to me, it shouldn't be controversial at all. It should be passed in the next Congress, and we are starting to have conversations. I think there's interest in both houses to try to kickstart that again. I think it's critical.
Next question, right back here.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Hi, Susan Hoyler from Qualcomm. My question is, and you may have the answer and you may not, I follow the activities of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assignment of Names and Numbering, and within that, there are different factions. One is the IP holders, others Government Advisory Committee, the ISPs, and there seems to be a reluctance by ICANN, a California company, to cooperate in taking down IP addresses. Like, even though we could have all this enforcement, you know, and the ISPs and the law enforcement, if ICANN, who's the choke point, if you want to call it, of administering numbering, doesn't take them down, then the pirates continue. And I'm just wondering, have your organizations had any interface with ICANN? What is the role of ICANN? What is the role of the U.S. government? What is the role of industry? If you have any comments, because to me it seems like if you don't have all the players at the table, including ICANN, which has the power to take numbers down or put them up, then we're kind of in a no-win situation. So if you have any comments on that, I would welcome.
Well, we've been trying to get ICANN to focus on this online infringement bill, which is still kind of in outline form, because clearly they have a role to play and clearly they have a stake in the matter. But to my knowledge, they've not quite quite focused on it.
I think this is another one of those situations, too, where some very smart people had thought about putting frameworks in place, and those frameworks aren't being enforced to the fullest extent of their capabilities. ICANN has in place agreements with registrars, which have provisions about their obligations to maintain who is data, for example, and to take steps to prevent abuses. And they don't fully enforce those contractual terms. And so I do think some more efforts are required there.
Okay, question right here.
So that,
identify
I'm
yourself.
sorry, Matt Shears with the Computer and Communications Industry Association. That GAO report discredited a lot of numbers, but one of the things that I think it sort of left standing, or at least untouched, was a lot of this, admittedly mostly anecdotal, but still compelling information about physical goods counterfeiting. And we have these toxic toothpaste stories, concerns about counterfeit goods getting into the military supply chain and so on. None of those are addressed by the most prominent policy debates that we're having. Right? So if you're kicking people offline or encouraging ISPs to kick people offline, building filtering into the network, that's not going to stop a counterfeit microchip from winding up in a Black Hawk, right? So why is it that our policy debate seems to focus so much on what I think is certainly the most controversial subject matter here, and probably areas where there's evidently a lot more consensus about physical goods counterfeiting often sort of gets brushed to the side and overlooked, and is therefore unaddressed by a lot of the legislative proposals we're discussing?
Let me build on that if I could. I know you want to jump in here, Steve. The 6 main areas of the IP report that came out in June were to lead by example and not have pirated works in the government, to have a transparent policy, to improve coordination among entities, to work with foreign governments, kind of the special 301s, to ensure or secure the supply chain, right? So this issue was highlighted as one of the key points in this report, as well as to collect better data about IP. So Steve, what are your thoughts on this issue of kind of the supply chain and the physical versus internet issue that Matt's touched on here?
I think Matt's talking about a different debate that's from a few years ago, perhaps. But what we're talking about here is not aimed at consumers. It's not aimed at internet service providers. They're strategic partners in this. The payment processors, the advertising networks, these are our strategic partners in dealing with the rogue websites that are engaged in piracy and counterfeiting online. Those are the folks we want to get out of the U.S. market as best we can. Now, to the extent that they are located here, their servers are here, that their domain name is registered through a U.S. registry, we can get very effective remedies through things like the in-rem seizure that ICE undertook at the end of June that Gigi mentioned earlier. And that was fantastic. The reality is, though, that a lot of these websites are not located here. They're not registered with registries here for their domains. So we need some sort of, and beyond that, some of the websites are candid about what they're doing. It's counterfeit stuff, and some people who haven't thought it through perhaps are willing to go there and buy that. A lot of these sites are deceiving people, and it's getting into our supply chain unintentionally. There are pharmaceutical sites that have logos and even certificates on them purporting to be licensed online pharmacies. They're all fraudulent. They're deceiving consumers into thinking that they're licensed, that they're safe, and they're neither. So for those sorts of sites located outside the U.S., it'd be great if we had a tool that would cut them off from the U.S. market with the cooperation of those strategic partners I've described. And I hope that if and when we see legislation that is balanced and hits the sort of the worst of the worst online, that everyone should agree have no place in an online market, that will all support it, not just merely not oppose it.
We'll get to many other topics, but Gigi does need to leave,
I do
so
have to
what's your
go.
final
So, I mean, I think
reaction?
Matt just made a fantastic point, and it's the thing that's frankly, I know Steve can't talk about ACTA, is holding up ACTA. I mean, there's agreement on 90% of ACTA. When it comes to physical goods, obviously we don't want to see, you know, counterfeit baby formula or, you know, bad microchips or batteries that blow up or brakes that don't work. There's agreement on that. But what brings all this stuff down and, you know, is the crazy stuff. And the crazy stuff is, you know, trying to go after things online, trying to rejigger the balance of fair use, trying to bring ISPs and online service providers into a police role, you know, where they're already protected by law to not be in that role. And frankly, it's good public policy, it's that way. Let's focus on the things we agree on and the things that do cause harm to health and safety. If ACTA was a health and safety, it was really a treaty that sought to, a trade agreement, I don't really think it's a trade agreement, but that's for a whole other conversation. It was a trade agreement that actually focused on, you know, protecting babies and protecting people from blowing up batteries. It would have been done by now. But it's not, because the crazy stuff, this effort to get ISPs to be the copyright cops and to punish consumers, has taken over the whole thing. So I say, let's focus on the important stuff. Let's get away from the crazy stuff. And maybe, you know, we will accomplish the goal of limiting some of the harm of IP infringement. And I got to go. Thanks, everybody.
By the same
Thank you for
token,
being here, Gigi.
by the same token, Gigi, and before you leave,
Yeah, go ahead.
I would have to say that I don't think we have done our ACTA negotiators any great service by focusing them on non-issues like threats of iPods being seized at the border and other myths surrounding the agreement, rather than allowing them to get down to the business on focusing on the economic harm, public health and safety harm, and doing the business of negotiating.
Fair enough. None of those myths, of course, proposed by public knowledge. But anyway.
Without getting into the, go ahead, Casey.
I just wanted to say it is an important distinction to make, though, between physical and digital, and we're seeing this happen in the courts, too, in terms of digital and digital with licensing, which is outside the purview of this conversation. What is a license and what is a, you know, this is for compensation and stuff, so we're not going to get into it. But, you know, an MP3 is not a knockoff Gucci handbag, and that's, you just got to keep that distinction very, very clear. One thing that Gigi didn't say is, you know, with something like ACTA, the other concern is exporting the portions of the US law that are punitive without exporting the exceptions. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an international copyright expert, but I follow this closely enough because there's two things that I'm concerned with. Is it going to be overbroad, and are the physical you know, product remedies going to bleed into the sort of digital prescriptions? And do we have a sense that, you know, when you're dealing in an international context, that the luxuries that we afford here and the exceptions are as valid on an international stage? And, you know, again, I'll leave that to smarter minds than mine, but I think it is important to bring up questions like yours, because, you know, there are clear distinctions that need to be emphasized.
Casey, let me use that to bring up a point we were talking about earlier, Stephen, which was technological protection measures and the issue of exporting, if you will, this notion. What has been done and what needs to be done, Stephen, on the issue of the circumvention question?
To tie it into Matt's frustration a little bit, I think that some of the larger issues that we've been discussing up here this morning are a little off topic, because a huge number of the more surgical recommendations that are contained in the IPEX report go directly to your concerns. I haven't done the nose count of the 33 recommendations that are there, but I would venture to say that most of them concern customs authorities. We in the entertainment software industry build in anti-piracy protections into the leading game consoles, such that if you were to download a game and try to play it on your Xbox 360 or your Wii or your PlayStation 3, you would not be able to play a burned copy. The consoles would recognize it as a burned copy and would lock it out from being played. Now, piracy, the arms race that it is, and the enormous economic rewards that exist, has given rise to a cottage industry of those who might not ever be involved in the actual infringement of a game. They might not copy games. All they do is design, manufacture, distribute, and market circumvention devices. And why not? Those things can sell for $50 or $80 a piece. They're produced for just a couple of bucks after the initial research and development efforts. And so that is their business. It's built every bit as much on the backs of legitimate content providers as those who actually pirate the games themselves. And these devices proliferate in the millions. And so one of the things that we have urged the administration to take a look at, and also Congress to take a look at. I'm very pleased that this idea is also reflected in the Senate Finance Committee's Customs Reauthorization Bill that was introduced last year, is to help Customs identify these products when they enter the market, to seize them in an expedited manner, and to keep them off of the market. Now, there are a couple of avenues that already exist in law for Customs to render this kind of assistance to rights holders. When Customs seizes an infringing shipment, a trademark infringing shipment or a copyright infringing shipment, it's obligated to notify the rights holder in interest of the facts of that seizure and provide information to them that can help in their own investigation of the situation, can help them trace the shipment back to its point of manufacture, to its point of export, and build its investigation accordingly. What we have urged is that these very same mechanisms be extended also when there are seizures of circumvention devices. And this is something that we're very pleased the Senate Finance Committee responded very positively to in our own discussions with the IPEC's office. The IPEC has responded very favorably to this idea of taking authority that already exists and extending it to products that so clearly facilitate infringement. So this is really when recommendations do come out of this process, I wouldn't be surprised if they are these kinds of surgical recommendations that don't make the headlines, but that actually make a tremendous amount of difference in the amount of information that industry is able to receive and how we are able to gear our investigations accordingly. And a final point on this is that all of this is ultimately a government resource conservation measure. After all, the more information about a seizure that Customs can provide to us, the more that we can undertake an investigation on the private side. We can then provide information back to Customs to make its own criminal enforcement actions bigger, more effective, and more efficient. So I think it really is an example of another cooperative mechanism that we can make some tweaks to and make it work even better. And that's a lot of what I see in the IPEC's report and why I'm so enthusiastic about it.
Thank you for that summary. Other questions? Yes, right over here.
My name is Jay Hellman. I'm the inventor of the techno-real estate term virtual adjacency. But in 1969, I had been working at the RAND Corporation, and I'd written a paper about privacy and information systems. Some of the discussion that I hear today rings some warning bells as to how ISPs would even detect that some of this was going on. And that's, to me, is very frightening. With respect to the thought that you had, or the question you had raised about pharmacy, why doesn't the government have a database that is instantly findable as to who are the, approved pharmacies and sellers? So at least somebody could double check if somebody is offering them something, it's kind of like the Better Business Bureau. Here's who's good, here's who's bad. At least as much as we know it. So that's my suggestion.
Any thoughts, Steve?
I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea. I suspect some people might not love that idea, but I'm happy to have that conversation.
I just wanted to add something. I mean, we've had 10 years of talking about this in the music industry. The technology exists. A voluntary copyright database or registry, the technology is there. The will might not be there. I think in some cases the law might not back it up. And again, I'm not an expert, but I don't think it can be a statutory or a mandated thing. I think it would have to be voluntary because it would throw us out of whack with some of our international treaty obligations. Now, if you can answer the riddle as to why something like that doesn't exist on the content side, which would be much easier, and you wouldn't have to do the type of layer inspection that you need to do that would bring tremendous privacy and fair use implications into the picture. Why? I don't know. If we knew the answer to that, I think we could all just go home and put our feet up.
But Casey, what are the key obstacles to a database?
Well, I got to tell you something, and here's where I say stuff that might offend the major labels, God forbid, and that's that for years and years and years they had systems on the compensation side that it's kind of more effective for them from a business perspective to not know who they have to pay. They know they have to pay Aerosmith. That might be good enough. I think that honestly on the content side there's a need to get your house in order, to have a corresponding protocol that everyone can recognize, that's perhaps managed by a neutral party, that can create a standard for metadata and watermarking and the other goodies that you would need to have, the introduction of non-invasive systems that could, say, yes, you can go through, and no, you can't.
How has Sound Exchange worked from your perspective?
I don't know. We can ask Brian.
Well, I want your perspective on.
My perspective is that Sound Exchange has been a very productive partner in wanting to have conversations because it behooves them to be seen as compensating artists appropriately, accurately, and on time. And so we encourage any of those. Future Music encourages any of those conversations between stakeholders. We remain neutral other than a couple of things. Let's pay the creators. And let's make sure that the mode of transmission and access to the marketplace is reasonably open as well. Now, again, the devil's in the details. What recipe of political will, technological will, and marketplace will you need to arrive at the proper conclusion to make this happen? I have no idea. But I would say that from what I see, Sound Exchange has been a very productive partner in those types of conversations. And I think that my organization would encourage anyone to have them at any level because it's a key to very, very many pieces of this riddle. Compensation, some intellectual property assurances that, without a certain set of assurances, let's face it, 10 years into a digital transition, the marketplace is very uncertain and that affects investment. And, if we can figure that out, we win. And anything that can be done proactively in that regard is probably a good thing without bringing down the heavy hammer and breaking the whole system.
We have time for about 2 or 3 more questions if there are any. Right over here.
Hi, Linda Kinney from the MPAA, and I recognize Gigi is gone now, so.
Go ahead.
I would have liked to, I will ask her this question after the fact. I guess one question I have is, everybody on the panel, including Gigi, was very supportive of the YouTube approach, these user-generated principles that YouTube negotiated with the content community. And I guess one question is, why can't something similar to that be implemented on a grander scale with the ISPs? Because, in fact, they're gatekeepers, just like YouTube is a gatekeeper. And one of the things Victoria's report does acknowledge is the content owners themselves cannot combat piracy on their own. They actually need to work in cooperation with gatekeepers like the ISPs. So I guess that's my question.
No, that's great, and I'll invite any of the panelists to address it. I do want to point out that we will be having internet service providers and others on future panels, in particular finding solutions to problems of copyright infringement on November 9th, and approaches by internet service providers around the world to copyright infringement are in some senses hoping to get at some of those issues. But any reactions from the panel on this question?
I would just say that, at this point, I talk to the technologists. I don't know them. I don't know their work intimately because, it's just crazy what they do. But I have the sense that, a lot of these things are going to slow down network. A lot of these network management practices have an implication for consumers. And if anybody wants to talk about that openly, that has the expertise, that's wonderful. But it depends where on network you install the sensors. It depends what they're supposed to look at. It depends which technology is used. I mean, there's a million factors there in implementing appropriate filters on network. And then, speaking for Gigi, there are the fair use concerns, which are hard for judges to decide. So, and there is no fair use machine.
I think the one thing about the YouTube, though, is that fair use really hasn't entered into that equation. And Gigi and the content owners all agree there actually have been very few false positives. Despite the fact that the content owner is being notified, the whole fair use debate is not going on in the context of YouTube. So I don't see, I think it's not necessarily true that the fair use issue has to be integrated into this whole discussion.
Well, there would need to be, an appropriate set of, there would be consumer recourse. Something would have to be built in through which somebody could make a reasonable claim against.
Right, and that's true for YouTube also.
Yeah, I would also add that there are non-trivial enforcement differences between disrupting or redirecting a stream of content and disrupting a download. And that even if a YouTube-type solution were implemented broadly with respect to streams of movie products, it wouldn't necessarily address the problem of movie downloads, unauthorized movie downloads. And so it is an effective solution as far as it goes, but it doesn't help our industry, for example, where an infringer will seek to download an entire game and must download an entire game before being able to
And let's not
use
forget
it.
about streaming, which is a different kind of protocol and is kind of becoming the thing that people are getting very, very used to in consumption. You need a steady stream of packet transmission and communication to have that not jitter or be disrupted. It's the same thing with VoIP. And a download, a one-to-one, the packets can get there eventually, whenever. That's that's probably easier to build a system around, but again, I'm out of my depth.
There's a larger question here, and it goes to the notion of voluntary undertakings to try and address the problem. And the beauty of a voluntary approach is you can work out the technical details that suit the particular parties at the table at any given moment. So it's my hope that more and more internet companies will recognize that they do have an interest in undertaking these agreements. I think a lot have. YouTube is no small player. And, the peer-to-peer use, for example, these folks are bandwidth hogs. They're eating up a lot of expense for internet service providers. And, some folks have undertaken it, some folks haven't. I look forward to more doing so.
Steve, is it a voluntary issue or a going after could voluntary agreements solve the problem, or do you need the heavy hand of enforcement? I mean, there's two messages you're delivering there.
Well, right, because there's two different categories of infringement. There's the more innocent style of, innocent not in the legal sense, but in the characteristic that it's, kids who don't necessarily think about copyright law, or in some cases who do, engaged in peer-to-peer file sharing or downloads, that sort of thing. But you also, and those sorts of uses, your sort of mainstream consumer uses, I think can be addressed with voluntary approaches to a large degree, not entirely, as Stevens pointed out for his industry. You also have commercial piracy and counterfeiting that's organized by crime syndicates. Let's not kid ourselves here. This is big business. Aside from drug running and arms sales, intellectual property theft is probably the most lucrative crime in the world. And when you compare the relative penalties for getting caught to those other two, it's obvious why a lot of organizations would want to get a piece of that action. For those folks, they're going to do everything they can to get around any voluntary agreements. They're going to do anything they can to circumvent the laws. We need strong medicine and effective remedies to go after those folks, but that can be targeted narrowly so as to only target the worst of the worst and not threaten legitimate activities by legitimate businesses.
There's one thing I want to say just really quickly on this subject as well. And if it's going to be voluntary and if this technology is technologies are experimental and we have space in the marketplace to apply them, seems to me that having more ISPs in the marketplace might aid that goal as well. And so you can't talk about free enterprise on one side and not recognize where it needs to exist on the other.
Well, without seeing anyone who hasn't asked a question who wants to, let's get Tom and Matt with their questions, if you could just pose them, and then we'll go ahead and get final reactions from the panel to those questions and to your observations about how the administration can effectively tackle internet piracy. Matt.
I actually think Casey very much hit on what I was saying, but isn't there a substantive difference between if YouTube implements some sort of filtering application, which voluntarily, and consumers decide they don't like it, it causes too much jitter, there's a lot of latency, they vote with their feet and they go somewhere else in the marketplace to somebody who's probably implemented something better. But if my broadband provider does that and it causes latency, whether it's in my content consumption or telemedicine applications, right? I can't vote with my feet because I only have one broadband provider.
Good luck to you.
Well, come to our Breakfast Club next Tuesday on this subject, and let's get Tom's comment or thought.
I have three broadband providers, broadband provider options, and I just want to make one general comment that discussing the issue of latency, the possibility that solutions to problems of online piracy might cause some latency in the network is, number one, not technically accurate. Those can be implemented as offline solutions. Number two, I think it's quite ridiculous in light of the amount of unnecessary traffic generated by the file sharing protocols that currently dominate internet piracy in the U.S. And so I had a question for Casey. I certainly, two questions. Number one, I don't necessarily support I think that we need to consider the option of network filtering at this point in time. But why do we make that a choice unnecessarily difficult by not correctly describing all the possible options? Yes, there are options that would be in line and would involve deep packet inspection. There are also filtering options that would involve using the very same file hashes that these systems are currently broadcasting all over the internet. So this is just a series of numbers. There's no conceivable privacy interest in it because it's already being broadcast all over the internet. ISPs could filter by those. No deep packet inspection required. Those hashes are very, very, very file specific, no risk of false positives. So there are solutions there. And then the second question would be the same general question I asked of Gigi, and that's, okay, I understand that free music, FMC is not in the same position as public knowledge. They did not actually actively defend entities like the distributors of file sharing programs, Grokster, Morpheus, Kazaa, LimeWire. But nevertheless, we need to figure out how do we want copyright owners to clean up the mess very deliberately created by those very bad actors. What is your suggestion for that other than notice forwarding or suing individual consumers?
Well, I'm hearing a couple of questions there, but I'm also hearing them kind of divulge to a main point. And I could just probably tidily sum that up and say, hey, if you came up with a silver bullet solution that was technological in nature, that would prevent the problem of piracy, and you could implement that in a mutually satisfactory way for rights holders, compensation, network providers, and everybody else that's a stakeholder, yes, let's do it. Can we do it tomorrow? I'm tired of having this conversation. The other parts of your question about the bad actors, absolutely. I mean, copyright is the bread and butter of people in my business, which is the music business. What I want to tell you even more than that, though, is that I like copyright so much that I want more creators to have exercise of that in a free marketplace. And obviously, we're going to need some protections there, and obviously there's going to be things to talk about. What we need to make sure is that on the road to achieving these remedies, be they technological or legal, that we don't foreclose the possibility of independent creators and entrepreneurs from existing in a free marketplace, which I'm sure you'll agree is the bedrock principle for economic and other innovations.
Any final words from Steve and Stephen?
Yeah, I'll just say that I think what comes out of this is, one, that there's, as I said, there's a dark side to the internet. And we need to take that seriously, and we need strong medicine to deal with it. These rogue sites are hurting the U.S. economy. They're threatening our health and safety, and we need strong medicine to take that on that's narrowly targeted to the worst of the worst. We also need to make sure that the rules of the internet generally don't prevent cooperative and voluntary agreements from being able to address IP piracy in the more mainstream market. And finally, as an overarching message, we've heard a lot of technical discussion, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different issues, all of which are raised in one form or another in the IPEX report. It may stun you to know that the IPEC office has a grand total of 1 permanent staffer. Victoria needs more resources, and the Global IP Center at the Chamber of Commerce is working hard in Congress to convince the appropriators to send some more money her way. She's got a few detailees from other agencies, which is great. The folks who are on loan from other agencies, for those of you not familiar with the government speak. And those folks are great too, but it's not the same as having permanent dedicated staff. She needs more resources. These issues are important enough that they deserve that.
Stephen?
Here to more resources for the IPEC. And I do think that Victoria is doing an outstanding job under very difficult circumstances and with very, very high expectations placed upon her and her office. Since the passage of the Pro-IP Act, I've been a part of innumerable discussions about what the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator should be doing upon arrival in office and where priorities should lie. And I've heard her tasked with no fewer than 3 full-time jobs, from coordinating internally the White House positions on IP, including in conjunction with PTO and with OSTP and the other agencies that have a role in substantive IP considerations. That's full-time job number 1. Full-time job number 2 is coordinating and liaising with industry, which we all know we tend to make into a full-time job as well. And then there's her actual job, the one that is contained in the Pro-IP Act, which is coordinating the U.S. agencies' approaches to IP in all of those various facets. I think it's significant that the IPEX report specifically identifies 19 different agencies and agency components that have a piece of this IP enforcement challenge. And her most important task, in my mind, and the one that she's doing exceptionally well, is providing those agencies with the support that they need to do their pieces of the job even better. Just to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, even the notion of what enforcement means is not something that is agreed upon by these 19 different agencies. This is something that I learned back in 1999 when I was back at the Department of Justice trying to figure out what was meant by Congress's mandate to create a National Intellectual Property Law Enforcement Coordination Council, the NIPLEC. Yes, Congress actually did that. But one of the first things we did was we got around the table and we said, okay, what's enforcement? And we would hear from DOJ, well, it's slapping handcuffs on people and putting them in jail. And we would hear from USTR, well, enforcement is about the enforcement of trade agreements. It's something that occurs country by country. And then we'd hear from Customs and they would say, well, enforcement is about seizing infringing product at the border. And so there is just a tremendous, really, I don't envy the NIPLEC. She's in a position where she's trying to, she's in a bit of a Tower of Babel situation where everybody thinks about enforcement quite differently, yet she's charged with responsibility for advancing everyone's enforcement mission. This is where I think it's fortunate that she's located within the Office of Management and Budget, because every agency needs an angel within the Office of Management and Budget to help with budgetary and staffing issues. This is where the approach of taking detailees from the agencies who know the agency's culture and go back and know what the agencies need to improve and enhance their own missions is an extremely positive approach, and one that Victoria has used quite strategically and quite well. And I just just want to commend her on a job well done, an extremely difficult task.
Well, before we thank our panelists for their wonderful observations, including that one, Stephen, I want to call two things to your attention. One, please fill out the survey on your way out and drop it on the table at the exit. And two, I've mentioned several of our events that are upcoming, both our Broadband Breakfast Club and our future Intellectual Property Breakfast Clubs. The best way to stay informed about our events is to go to broadbandbreakfast.com and just sign up for our free daily email blast in the upper right-hand corner. So that way you'll always make sure you're familiar with our next events. Before we thank our panelists, I want to recognize our sponsors, National Cable and Telecommunications Association and Public Knowledge, and to thank each of you for your time in being here, and of course, Stephen and Gigi and Casey and Steve. Thank you very much.